Ipe and all our friends and colleagues here at the African Leadership Center and King's College. Thank you very much for a very warm welcome, and thank you again for the very generous introduction, the generous words. It's such a pleasure to be here at King's College and at the African Leadership Center. And being here is somewhat nostalgic for me. I was a student at the LSC many years ago, and looking around at so many young faces here, I'm a bit embarrassed to say how many years ago that was. But I'm also a professor, and so I'm happy to be in this academic environment, especially after the utter madness of politics. I think that is a very nice place. So I must thank the management of the Africa Leadership Center for the kind invitation to be here. I think this is a good place to be after the rough and tumble of our politics. King's College London, I think, is also to be commended for its contribution to training so many outstanding leaders in Nigeria over the years. And of course, so many who are here now. Professor Olonishaki is, of course, one, and so many others who are here. Professor Kenneth Onwukadike, a distinguished historian, who was also the first indigenous vice chancellor of Nigeria's first university, the University of Ibadan, is an alumnus of King's College. We also have Mrs. Koforola Pratt, the founder of the first school of nursing in Nigeria. She also was here at King's College, and a recipient of the Florence Nightingale Award from the International Red Cross. The doctor in our team, my team coming from Lagos, Dr. Nicholas Odifren, is here also. He's also an alumnus of King's College, and he never lets us forget about it. And some of us have had to caution him, that to no avail, of course, that being here at King's at some point doesn't make you Desmond Tutu. I also think we should agree. I think we should agree that the African Leadership Center deserves commendation for how it has, in a few short years of its establishment, gained a stellar reputation for teaching and research, and for leadership studies that are focused on the African continent, and training a whole new generation of scholars and practitioners on issues of peace, security, and international development. I know that the theme of the King's Africa Week 2023 was, as has been said, changing Africa in a shifting global landscape. So I will tailor my remarks this evening to this broad theme, while also seeking to answer the question of how Africa can prosper in this shifting global landscape. I think that a point on which there will be no reasonable dispute is that we live in a complex and somewhat confusing period. The lines have never been more blurred in the various conceptual prisms through which we view the world. The existence of several centers of political and economic power since the unipolar world of the 1990s has meant that there are various ways in which global developments are viewed. Of course, in addition to the United States, we have China, Russia, the European Union, the UK, India and Brazil as dominant regional powers. The perspectives, decisions, and actions of these actors impact not only on their regions, but across the world, including in multilateral forums all across the world. The Russian-Ukrainian war is, if we start with that, to just consider how that has impacted the world, and in fact has impacted Africa. Apart from its consequences for international peace and security, that war has signaled a breakdown of the global order, which emerged at the end of the Second World War, And it is a source of concern to many African countries who now have to steer their way delicately between the major powers. But the more immediate and consequential fallout of the war, as we all know, are the sharp hikes in food prices, especially wheat, sunflower, and sunflower oil, and even rice and maize, and then fuel and fertilizer prices. Many African countries, of course, are heavily dependent on one or both of the warring parties for food and oil. So when the conflict began in February last year, the price of wheat increased by 67% from the price in December 2021. Oil prices similarly went through the roof. International prices for oil averaged $100 per barrel in 2022 as compared to about $70 per barrel in 2021. And then also, given that key manufacturing countries are oil importers, higher oil prices invariably translated to higher prices for manufactured products as well. So these price shocks and disruption of supply chains of various commodities across Africa led to high inflation at a time when most countries were struggling to overcome the economic and social fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially debt and foreign currency crisis. The situation was relieved somewhat by the deal that was brokered to enable the export of Ukrainian wheat. For Nigeria, let me say that despite our strong objection to the invasion of Ukraine, as evidenced by our support for the UN resolution condemning the invasion, we've managed to maintain good relationships with both parties. We're now in the process of working out a grain supply from Russia, coordinated by the World Food Programme, and we recently accepted to provide some space, port space, in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, for the distribution of grain from Ukraine to other West African countries. But I think the economic fallout of the war for us in Africa should be an introspective moment, especially on the issue of self-sufficiency in food production. And there's some good news here and there about that. Zimbabwe, for instance, had its highest ever wheat harvest of over 375,000 tons in 2022. And by that increase in production, it achieved self-sufficiency, at least in wheat production, which is a major component of its food. It achieved this feat by increasing land under cultivation, by improving fertilizer distribution, and ensuring irrigation in the winter months, and an active collaboration between government and the private sector. This means that Zimbabwe is insulated from the sharp increases in global wheat prices, or indeed further fallout from the war in Ukraine. What this clearly shows is that by proactive measures, African countries can turn this crisis and others into opportunity. It may also be a moment for even bigger ideas. We may reconsider our approach to food production using climate-smart methods that protect and enhance. The crisis is central to current global complexities. Just a few days ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released a report where it cautioned that if speedy action were not taken, global warming might attain the 1.50 degrees centigrade much earlier than expected, even possibly in the 2030s. Now, this is a worrying prospect if we consider that African countries, despite being the lowest emitters of carbon, are the worst hit by its effects and the least capable of quickly responding to or mitigating the damage that may be caused by extreme weather events. At the same time, a competition for increasingly scarce resources such as water and arable land is fueling conflict and complicating tensions between communities in many parts of Africa, especially in the northern parts of Africa. In our case in Nigeria, in the northern part, in the central and northern part of Nigeria, we have a lot of what we call the farmer-herder crisis, and these are of course very deadly conflicts over arable land and water. But African countries have a little more to worry about, even in the inevitable transition to net zero by 2050, and in our case in Nigeria by 2060. For us in Africa, energy poverty and its implications for extreme poverty are as existential as the climate crisis itself. In 2020, 52% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, about 568 million people, had no access to electricity. 19 of the 20 countries with the lowest clean cooking access rates are in Africa. In practical terms, these energy deficits produce staggering defects. For instance, the clean cooking deficits lead to really huge numbers of premature deaths from household air pollution in sub-Saharan Africa in particular annually. Of course, gender inequities are exacerbated, and millions of women and children suffer from critical health conditions on account of clean cooking deficits, and of course the use of heavy pollutants like firewood. Due to the electricity deficits, half of secondary schools and a quarter of health facilities in sub-Saharan Africa have no power. And for many gas-rich but energy-poor countries in Africa, such as Nigeria, we are extremely gas-rich. We have huge reserves of gas, but energy-poor. We recognize that the role of natural gas, being a much cleaner fossil fuel, must play a transition role. It must play as a transition fuel in the short term to facilitate the establishment of baseload energy capacity and address clean cooking deficits in the form of LPG. But there has been strong resistance to this. I mean, we believe that not just because we're gas rich, but because gas is much cleaner fossil fuel. We believe that gas must be transition fuel for us. And the reason why we take this position is because there is no country yet that has been able to develop industrially using just renewable energy. And just for base load, just to get sufficient base load for industry, you absolutely must have some, and in our case, gas. But several global north nations have placed restrictions on the use of development funds for gas infrastructure in Africa, with ripple effects in the private financial sector. While I think it's just important to explain this a bit, So the global north, the global northern countries argue that gas projects in Africa should not be funded anymore. And the reason, of course, is that this is seen, I think I know how to do this now. Okay. The reason, of course, is that this is seen as, in some ways, a hindrance to net zero by 2050. While some others, the US and others, have created exceptions in their policies, the intended flexibility is not yet clear. So clearly, limiting the development of domestic gas projects, which is a critical energy transition pathway for Africa, in our opinion, of course, violates the principles of equity and justice, and of course poses challenges for African nations, while in truth making an insignificant dent in global emissions. Even if we triple electricity consumption in African countries, aside from South Africa, solely using natural gas, this will just add 0.6% to global emissions. But and really, when you look at this, especially in relation to what can happen to poverty using gas as transition fuel, and the dramatic changes that would have on livelihoods and lives in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we think that it's only fair to argue that gas and gas projects in Africa ought to continue to be funded by the multilaterals and by Europe and the US. But Africa can also lead, in my view, a revolutionary approach to climate change, one that recognizes climate action as the job engine for Africa. James Wangi and his colleagues at Climate Action Platform for Africa have presented this compelling point of view. They argue that instead of pushing the narrative of Africa as a victim and or insisting on business as usual growth, which would make Africa eventually a big future emitter, especially as doubling population and possibly even quintupling of income per capita could propel Africa to the top of the emitter league tables in the coming decades. Africa should instead lead the way in tackling climate change by leveraging on its renewable energy potential, young workforce, green energy, green manufacturing. In other words, Africa can provide jobs for millions of its young people. It can prosper. It can lead in the fight against climate change by becoming the green or carbon-free civilization. And we have the comparative advantage to do so. I think that this is an interesting proposition, and I think that just looking at all of the components of it, of course, we won't have the time to do so today. The world were quitting regional integration agreements, etc. African countries were building on the Pan-African legacy of leaders like Kwame Nkrumah to establish a continental market. And I think that the AfCFTA will overcome the constraints of Africa's small, fragmented markets. And it will have significant impact on commerce within the continent, both in goods and services. And this will be particularly so if adequate attention is paid to building regional value chains within the continent. And so I think, just looking at the possibilities for the AfCFTA, they're huge. And I'm glad to say that a lot of work is being done today to ensure that the market is as robust as was planned. And one expects that the participation of African countries, it has almost 100% subscription, will make this truly, a model regional market. For many of us, there's a strong conviction also that digitalization offers the best opportunity for leapfrogging for Africa. And of course, as we know, digital technologies are being deployed across Africa to provide solutions in agriculture, in education, in fintech, in healthcare. It's also being deployed in logistics and transport. And I think it has a potential to be used also in practically, all aspects of commerce and business. Smart housing solutions, smart power grids, there's just potential everywhere. The story of mobile telephony, for instance, has provided a platform for the use of digital technologies in daily lives in Africa. Due to mobile telephony, Africa is ahead of other parts of the world in terms of fintech and payment solutions. The continent accounts for about half of the world's mobile money accounts. And African countries are using AI-enabled surveillance technologies for facial recognition to monitor and to respond to crime. Perhaps even better known, I'm sure that many of us are familiar with the use of drones to deliver medicines in Rwanda, and I think there's some effort to do that also in Ghana. Such is the impact that this has had, that digitization has had, that just since 2016, and despite 2 recessions in Nigeria, and even a global pandemic, 6 technology startups have achieved the status of unicorns. In other words, companies that are valued at over $1 billion. So there's great potential and, of course, a lot of hard work going on there. Another great resource, which I believe will enable Africa to cope with a rapidly changing world, is our diaspora. And I think that instead of lamenting the brain drain, which admittedly is costly, Africa should organize itself to take advantage of its diaspora, some of whom, of course, are here in this audience. And I'm not about to suggest that you should all ship home or anything like that, because I see a few apprehensive-looking faces around here. I think that African diaspora, and of course, African diaspora is substantial. I mean, we already see the remittances in the order of 96 billion and so on and so forth in, even just in sub-Saharan Africa. But the African diaspora is a major source of strength. And they have also, in several instances, offered themselves for public service, which is, in my view, is also very important. However, I see the diaspora as our vanguard for keeping up with the rest of the world. Our diaspora is a secret weapon. As we've seen time and time again, members of our diaspora keep a close tab on developments at home. And they often invest their resources in business or setting up facilities with cutting-edge services in medicine, in education, in finance. For instance, the contributions of the Ethiopian diaspora that helped to fund the building of the great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is one such major example of diaspora involvement in development. Kenya has also licensed a diaspora investment fund that will enable Kenyans living abroad to invest safely at home. The hospital where I had an operation last year, where I had a procedure, is based in Lagos, and the specialists that treated me practice both in Nigeria and the UK. As a matter of fact, just today I was at I was seeing 2 of the 6 surgeons who carried out the procedure on me here in London. And what is evident is that we can derive benefits from all of our resources, both at home and in the diaspora, and it's becoming easier and easier by the day. In my few years of service as Vice President of Nigeria, I've been quite fascinated by the place of academic rigor in both policy formulation and perhaps more importantly in execution. In Nigeria, our social investment program, which is possibly the largest in sub-Saharan Africa, was a product of excellent policy research that has also addressed the problems, of how. Because that is always the big problem. How do you get it done? And how do you get it done effectively? And the results in our case, our homegrown school feeding program is an award, has won several awards, where we feed about 9.5 million children daily and created huge opportunities for farmers who sold their produce to the program. Our microcredit program for 2.4 million informal traders was also rigorously evidence-based. The delivery mechanism was also well researched, and the electronic platform, which was developed by a very young team to deliver it, is now called the Growth Platform. It also has won, at least 2-3 international awards. So I think that there is a lot to be said for serious policy and serious policy papers, especially those that address the hows. Similarly, the insights from the study titled Conflicts in the Sahel Region and Developmental Consequences, which was undertaken by Fumi here, Professor Olorunshaki, and her colleagues, helped to inform the thinking and design of our National Livestock Transformation Plan, which is an innovative, sustainable approach to resolving the deadly conflicts around pasture and water between farmers and herders in Nigeria, and one which became a template for addressing similar problems in the Sahel. So our National Livestock Transformation Plan, again, was the product of serious research, and especially research that speaks to how to get things done. So I think that there is a lot that can be said for working together with research institutions, with universities and all of that. And I think that is becoming better appreciated by governments and government officials determined to make a difference in their countries. Let me conclude by saying that Africa can take full advantage of the global complexities we see today, and indeed thrive in the face of uncertainties and disruption. The decisive factor will be knowledgeable leadership committed to good governance. knowledgeable leadership committed to good governance. Indeed, if you asked me, 3 things that would determine our ability to turn the problems and complexities of our continent around for good, I will say 1, knowledgeable leadership committed to good governance, 2, knowledgeable leadership committed to good governance, and you can guess 3, knowledgeable leadership committed to good governance. Thank you all very much.